In 594 BC, a farmer in Athens could lose his family, not to war, not to plague, to a loan. If he missed a payment, his creditor didn't just take the land. He could take the farmer's children, his wife. Eventually, the farmer himself, sold into slavery, sometimes to a buyer overseas, never to return. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't an exaggeration used by later historians to make a point. It was written into Athenian law. And by the early 6th century BC, so many farmers had defaulted that Athens was not a city sliding toward crisis. It was a city that had already arrived. The only question left was whether it would tear itself apart before anyone fixed it. This is a story of how debt nearly ended Athens before Athens ever became Athens, and how the fix came from a man who, by his own admission, made almost everyone furious. To understand the crisis, you have to understand what Athens actually was before it was a democracy, before it was a naval power, before anyone carved a temple into the Acropolis. Athens was a farming region. Most people worked small plots of land in the countryside, called Attica, and Attica's soil was not generous. Good for olives and grapes, mediocre for grain. In a bad year, and there were plenty, a farmer might not grow enough wheat to feed his own household through winter, so he borrowed. He borrowed from a wealthier neighbor, usually a member of the aristocratic class called the eupatриdae, the well-born. These were families who owned the best land, controlled the political offices, and effectively wrote the laws a farmer would later be crushed by. Here's where it gets brutal. The loan wasn't secured by money or property in the way we'd recognize today. It was secured by the farmer's own body and the bodies of his family. If a farmer took out a loan, a stone marker called a horos was driven into his land, publicly announcing that this plot and its owner now belonged in part to a creditor. These farmers had a name, hectomoroi, meaning six-parters, because they were obligated to hand over 1/6 of their harvest to their creditor every single year, whether the harvest was good or catastrophic. 1/6 doesn't sound crushing, until you remember this was owed regardless of yield. A drought didn't lower the payment. It just made it more likely you couldn't make it. And when a hectomoros defaulted, which, given Attica's soil and weather, was almost inevitable for a large number of them, the terms were unambiguous. His land could be seized, his family could be sold, and if none of that covered the debt, he could be sold into slavery himself, sometimes shipped outside of Attica entirely, permanently removed from his own community. This wasn't a hidden abuse of the system. It was a system. You might expect a system this harsh to correct itself. It didn't. It got worse. For a few reasons that are worth sitting with, because they show up again and again across history whenever debt and inequality collide. First, the aristocracy who wrote the laws were the same people benefiting from them. There was no independent judiciary looking out for farmers. The eupatриdae controlled the archonships, the top political offices, and interpreted the law in ways that favored creditors, because the creditors and the lawmakers were often the same 9 families rotating through power. Second, land in Attica was finite. Every plot seized by a wealthy creditor made the wealthy family wealthier and reduced the number of independent farmers, which meant fewer people paying the state obligations, more people falling into dependency, and a shrinking base of citizens who had any stake in defending the city if it came to war. Third, and this is the part that made Athens genuinely combustible, a large number of Athenians weren't just in debt. They were already enslaved because of debt, working land that used to be theirs for a family that now legally owned them. By the early 6th century BC, ancient sources describe a society on the edge of civil war. Not metaphorically, actual armed conflict between the indebted poor and the land-owning rich was being openly discussed as a likely outcome if nothing changed. The historian Plutarch, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier accounts, describes Athens at this moment as a powder keg. Extreme wealth inequality, a large enslaved through debt population living inside the same city as their former equals, and a political system with zero mechanism for the majority to change any of it, because political power was tied to land ownership, the very thing being stripped away. This is worth pausing on, because it's the engine of the entire crisis. The people harmed by the system had no legal way to fix the system. The people who controlled the system had no incentive to fix it. Something outside the normal political process was going to have to intervene. In 594 BC, some sources say 592, Athens did something unusual. Both sides, the desperate poor and the anxious rich, agreed to hand extraordinary power to a single man to fix the crisis before it fixed itself through violence. His name was Solon. Solon wasn't a king. He wasn't from the very top tier of the aristocracy, though he was well connected enough to have held the position of archon, one of Athens' top magistrates. What made him acceptable to both sides wasn't wealth or bloodline. It was that he had a reputation, deserved or not, for being reasonable. He'd made his living partly through trade, which gave him some sympathy for commoners, but he also came from a noble family, which gave the aristocracy some confidence he wouldn't simply confiscate everything they owned. In short, he was a compromise candidate in a situation where compromise seemed almost impossible. Athens gave Solon what's called extraordinary powers, essentially a temporary legal mandate to rewrite the rules of the entire society. This is a detail that tends to get glossed over, because it's genuinely wild. A city on the edge of civil war looked at one man and said, "Fine, you decide." Solon later wrote poetry reflecting on this moment. And yes, this is one of the odder facts of ancient Athenian history, that a debt crisis reformer left behind verse explaining his own economic policy. In one surviving fragment, he essentially says, "I did what was necessary, not what either side wanted, and that's exactly why both sides are angry with me." That's not spin. That's an accurate preview of what came next. Solon's central reform had a name, Sysacthia. It translates, roughly, to the shaking off of burdens. And it did exactly what it sounds like. First, Solon canceled existing debt secured against the person of the debtor. Every horo stone marking a farmer's plot as debt encumbered was ordered removed. Ancient sources describe this almost literally. Stones physically pulled out of the ground across Attica. Second, and more significant, Solon abolished debt bondage entirely, going forward. No Athenian citizen could ever again be enslaved for defaulting on a debt. This wasn't a temporary relief measure. It was a permanent structural change to how debt worked in Athenian law. Third, and this is the part that gets skipped in the shorter version of the story, Solon tried to undo the damage already done. Athenians who had been sold into slavery abroad because of debt were, where possible, tracked down and bought back, redeemed at public expense, and returned to Athens. Try to sit with the scale of that for a second. This wasn't a policy adjustment. This was a government actively spending resources to locate its own citizens who had been legally sold as property under the previous system and bring them home. That's not something you do to fine-tune an economy. That's something you do because the previous system had already produced a humanitarian catastrophe, and everyone involved knew it. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because Solon's debt cancellation is often told as an unambiguous triumph. It was received that way at the time by anyone. The poor were furious because Solon did not redistribute land. This is critical. Canceling debt bondage freed people from slavery and erased the specific debts that had been secured against their bodies, but it did not seize aristocratic estates and hand them to the landless. Some Athenians had expected, or at least hoped for, a full land redistribution, breaking up the great estates of Eupatridae and dividing the land among the poor. Solon refused. The rich were furious for the opposite reason. They just had a significant portion of their wealth, money owed to them, land they'd acquired through foreclosure, legally erased overnight. Some aristocratic families had built real fortunes off exactly the lending practices Solon outlawed, and that fortune simply vanished by decree. There's a detail from Plutarch that captures attention perfectly, without needing embellishment. Solon's own friends, apparently tipped off in advance about the debt cancellation, borrowed large sums of money right before the announcement, then benefited enormously when those debts were wiped out. Solon was accused of insider dealing in his own reform, by people on his own side. Whether the accusation was fair or not, the fact that it stuck at all tells you how little trust existed in the system, even the system being built to fix the previous system. So to summarize where Athens stood after Sysacthia, the poor felt betrayed because they didn't get land. The rich felt robbed because they lost wealth. And Solon himself was accused of corruption by both sides at various points. By most measures, that sounded like a policy failure. It wasn't. Here's the part of the story that tends to get lost, because everyone was angry makes for a less satisfying ending than the hero fixed everything. But the actual outcome is more interesting than a clean victory. Solon's reforms didn't just cancel debt. They restructured who could become enslaved in Athens going forward, permanently removing debt bondage as a legal mechanism. That single change reshaped the incentive structure of the entire Athenian economy. Wealthy Athenians could no longer build fortunes through predatory lending against citizens' freedom. If you wanted to get rich, you now had to find other means: trade, land management, eventually the silver mines at Laurium that would fund Athens' navy generations later. Solon also opened up political participation beyond the narrow aristocracy, organizing citizens into new classes based on wealth rather than pure bloodline, which meant a successful farmer or merchant, even one without noble ancestry, could now hold political office. This didn't create full democracy. That came almost a century later under Cleisthenes, but it cracked open a system that had previously been a closed loop of 9 aristocratic families, making all the decisions that governed everyone else. And critically, Athens did not descend into the civil war that seemed almost inevitable in the years before Solon's reforms. That's easy to take for granted with the benefit of hindsight, but contemporaries did not take it for granted at all. A society that armed factions of poor debtors and anxious landowners eyeing each other across a shrinking pool of trust did not, in fact, tear itself apart. It restructured instead. That is, by any reasonable standard, a success, just not the kind that leaves anyone cheering. Here's the detail that empire economics viewers tend to appreciate the most, because it's almost too perfectly ironic to be real, and yet it's well documented. Once Solon finished his reforms, he left, voluntarily, According to Plutarch and other ancient sources, Solon made Athenians swear an oath to maintain his laws unchained for 10 years, and then he left the city for a decade, traveling to Egypt and elsewhere, specifically so that he would not be present to be pressured into amending the very reforms he'd just imposed. Think about what that means. The man who had just been trusted with near total authority to rewrite Athenian society did not stick around to enjoy that authority, consolidate power, or install himself as a permanent leader, which, given the crisis conditions, he plausibly could have done. He fixed the immediate emergency, locked and fixed with an oath, and physically removed himself from the situation so nobody, not the poor demanding more, not the rich demanding less, could talk him into reversing it. It's worth noting Solon wasn't naive about what would happen after he left. His own poetry, again, is almost eerily self-aware. He predicted that factional conflict would likely return to Athens eventually because he hadn't solved the underlying tension between rich and poor, only defused a specific debt crisis that had brought it to a head. He was right. Decades after Solon left, Athens had fallen to tyranny under Pisistratos, an aristocrat who exploited exactly the class tension Solon had identified but not eliminated. Solon's reforms bought Athens time and structure. They didn't buy permanent stability. Nothing does. But here's why this obscure 6th century debt crisis matters enough to spend 30 minutes on, instead of treating it as ancient trivia. Every major feature people associate with classical Athens, the democracy, the citizen assembly, the idea that political participation shouldn't depend purely on noble birth, traces back, at least partially, to the structural cracks Solon put into the old aristocratic system. Cleisthenes gets credit for founding Athenian democracy roughly a century later, and that credit is deserved. But Cleisthenes was building on a foundation, not starting from nothing. The foundation was a society that had already been forced, by economic catastrophe, to accept that governance couldn't remain the exclusive property of 9 families forever. And underneath all of that sits a specific mechanism that started the entire chain of events. Debt secured against a human being's own freedom, structured so that bad luck, a poor harvest, an unlucky year, could permanently convert a free citizen into property. Solon didn't eliminate debt. He didn't eliminate inequality. He eliminated one specific, catastrophic failure mode, the ability of an economic system to consume the very citizens it depended on. That's a narrower achievement than saved Athens. But it might be the more important one, because the thing that nearly ended Athens wasn't poverty and it wasn't wealth. It was a legal structure that let the two feed on each other until there was nothing left to negotiate with. Solon's laws didn't make anyone rich. They just made sure that being poor in a bad year didn't cost you your freedom. Almost 26 centuries later, most functioning economies still operate on that basic premise, that a debt is a debt, not a claim on your body. It's easy to assume that's just how things have always worked. It isn't. Someone had to build that wall. In Athens, it was one unpopular reformer, a pile of removed stones, and a 10-year trip to Egypt so nobody could talk him out of it.